So with this module, what we really wanted to do is want to help make sure you understand how to identify regional architecture, how it supports long-range planning, describe the relationship between the planning activities and the use of the architecture, how to identify projects from the architecture for implementation, and how you use architecture to help budget and program ITS projects. So those are the outcomes we're looking for today. So we're all set in just the general idea of with the life cycle of our project, from a planning perspective, long range planning. Changing my glasses. We're looking at the problems that we have that we need to address in the transportation system. Looking at it from not just short term but long term. What are these issues? How are the strategies we put in place, the objectives we want to attain, and how do we solve that with ITS? Going through that, out of this planning process, we identify a project or several projects, and we program and budget that tip cycle. So we're saying we're going to do this, we're going to implement this project, it's going to solve these problems for us, and this is the budget we're going to associate with that. Now that process comes a funded project, and we get into implementation. Implementation, we're developing the project, developing the systems, we put them in place, we deploy them, we test them, and then that implemented project is operated and maintained. That operations and maintenance project's now gone, but the system remains, the resulting system remains. Now we want to make sure we're monitoring and evaluating that project. Did it actually do what we expected it to do in solving the problem? And if it didn't, we get those results back into our planning process, and we may have another gap we need to fill, another gap that didn't maybe get filled like we thought it was going to. So that cycle continues from planning through implementation. Architecture can assist us in the planning process as we're looking forward to what we need to do. That helps us with understanding what the projects are and what they constitute as far as scope and whatnot, what different systems are involved, helps us budget for that. And then on implementation, it actually feeds the system engineering process. Those functions we're talking about, the standards we're identifying with the information exchanges, those all feed the implementation and system engineering activities. Project built.
Is it conceivable that eventually the architecture would expand into operations maintenance through, for example, automatic pavement, quality conditions ratings, or
wanted to feed that? Yeah, sure. If you're collecting that kind of information, then yeah, I can see how that could feed into the architecture as well. Being able to show that that's something we want to gain out of that implementation, that would then be something you want. That'd be an implementation that would be monitoring. Yes.
I'm just thinking about the recent emphasis on smart cities and the expansion of technology into a lot of day-to-day operations of the cities fulfill.
Right. Well, but that's the ultimate result, right? Yeah. It's that the systems put in place are feeding that operation, and the information that you need is planned for and implemented. So I think that from the architecture standpoint, that codifies it in your project, and the results are what you're collecting during operations and implementation or management. Okay.
Is the cost benefit analysis for a given ITS project conducted separately, or can that be incorporated into this architecture?
I think that I don't see that that analysis directly would be in the architecture as much as it would be fed by the architecture. The analysis would be understanding what we want to be looking for as far as benefits, the functions that are performed, how they actually influence that analysis.
Yeah, I mean, so it's a separate module.
I think so. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, we're going to talk first about the planning aspect of this. So architecture really kind of all work together about developing this architecture. It's kind of a consensus vision of where we're going with ITS. Okay, so we can all say we're going to have these different systems. They're going to have these functionalities. they're going to exchange information this way. So from a planning and operations standpoint, that gives us that vision that we all kind of rally around and actually deploy systems to it. So now it's a reference for us to all look to together. So it gives us that addresses long range and short range projects, or long range strategies and short range projects. So this diagram is really looking at that same life cycle for a project, but it's laying it out linearly. So we have our planning aspects here on the left-hand side of this orange division line. These are all those programs. We have our operations plan. We have our TIP. We have our long-range transportation plan. Architecture is helping informing this ITS implementation plan. It lays out this is the ITS we're going to implement here in the region. So we have that defined, but also the information exchanges that we establish in the architecture informs the communications plan that we want to implement for ITS. That those we have a tie-ins and long-range strategies and understand how we might want what we could be doing strategically from the architecture as well, feeding into the long-range plan. So as we proceed past planning, getting out of the TIP process, we're now into projects. Projects are coming out of the TIP process, and we're getting into more of the system engineering of those projects. Now, what are we? What's the feasibility of the project? What kind of environmental, impacts will it have that we need to take into account? But as you look at this green line defining where we are with these studies in the early parts of projects, and where we get into actual system engineering and preliminary design and whatnot with that project, we're needs focused on this left-hand side. Where everything should be based on those needs, especially in the planning process for satisfying a need. That drifts through here until we get into this system engineering component, and now we're looking at requirements. Those needs are now, we're putting that into something that's definitive. The project is now being developed, and that's going to be driven by requirements. Those requirements are related to the needs that we're trying to address. Okay. So architecture helps us up here in the planning side, informs our implementation plan for ITS, our communications plan, helps us with strategies and understanding where we're going in the long-range transportation plan. Then it also helps us with concepts of operation, get into system engineering. The system engineering, the SEDIT tool, I'll talk about a little just briefly later on, that actually is all focused on system engineering using architecture content. You can actually produce a draft concept of operations for a project out of that tool. It'll fill it in with all the components you have defined in the architecture. They fit in the different formats for concepts of operation. That gives you a draft to start with. There's a lot more work to do, but that's how you can really help. We're also developing requirements when we develop an architecture. We're going to talk about that as we go through this training. We're associating requirements with the project. Those are high level from an architecture perspective and their system engineering side of things. That actually gives us a start in the system engineering details we need to get into. So architecture is really hitting all of these. It has something to help us with along the way.
Yes, just a question. Since the MPO, I guess, owns the regional architecture, or is the holder, actually. What's the difference in role between the way that the MPO should plan? I mean, should the MPO be specifying projects themselves, or should we be leaning on our local agencies to give us that information proactively? I mean,
I guess do it now, right? You ask the agencies.
Yeah. Should we be trying to think ahead and suggest things, or should we?
I think you're a stakeholder in it, just like everybody else. But it's a partnership, right? It's working with the agencies about where we're going with ITS. That's the one thing about architecture. I feel there's other things too. It's not the only thing. But architecture, get people together, start talking about projects in ITS, and all these ideas start floating around. I didn't know you were doing that.
Yeah.
And then now we got something we're talking about in a side conversation that takes us a different way with the project. Just collecting the projects here, just from the draft that we put out back in the summer, and pulling things together. There's all these projects now defined in the architecture. Those are coming from those stakeholders. I think that's a great way to do it, right? You go through the process, you solicit for projects that you need to be putting in the plan with the agencies, they're offered, but if they're offering it from the context of an architecture framework that you've already put together and agreed upon, saying this is what my project's going to do, my project architecture looks like this is how it fits within the region. Now you've got a common place to talk about. The framework's established. You now have that conversation. But I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at the bigger picture of the entire transportation system, multiple modes, multiple jurisdictions, all coming together, and you have the bigger.
Just saying if there's a gap somewhere, then we could maybe proactively communicate.
Yeah, I think it's a strategic issue for the MPO. I mean, for example, with roadway projects, you tend to rely on your local public agencies to submit the projects and a call for projects. In transit, the MPO has been more proactive in defining. If you determine that local agencies are submitting projects that are consistent with the ITS architecture and meeting the needs that you see, maybe you don't need to get involved. But if on the other hand, you're seeing that there are some gaps, that would be that would imply a stronger role for the MPO to be involved in the identification and advancement of those projects.
Cliff, just wanted to add one thing to that as well. I know you and I think we were kind of like talking about, and this may tie more on the TISMO side, so we can cover that a little bit later. But I think all the hard work of coordination and bringing all the stakeholders together that MPO is leading right now, I think it makes sense just to have kind of like this continue on a regular basis so that we don't have to go back 2033 and say, hey, the last time it was done was in 2023. It kind of like goes back to the 2014 version. So having that continuity and partnership and maybe collaboration, kind of like having a quarterly meeting or something that really ties all these groups back together is maybe one thing we should definitely recommend coming out of this as well. And then it ties back to the TISMO as well. Like there are a lot of ideas, great ideas and things that can be done, but every agency kind of like depend on each other. And how can we have maybe, depending on the type of the application and what we are trying to achieve, maybe there could be an agency that can take a lead with MPO still being kind of like maybe the overarching, someone who can be kind of like the guardian, and then have individual agencies. If it's transit, I think it comes down to Indigo and Matt and his team. If it's Indianapolis in general, I think Nathan and his team, and then in DOT, I think again, Ed Cox, Jonathan, you guys need to kind of like maybe be part of that co-leads for those individual applications. So,
so we're doing some self-funded aspects too, but if we went for federal grant dollars at some point, I mean, would that be something that the MPO would do as more original, submission anyway? I got the impression we'd have to interact at least with other regional agencies to even be eligible for grant monies in the future, right?
Be interesting.
It's worth investigating. I can't say I have the definite answer on that. I mean, we would certainly be involved, but whether or not you have to pull in other agencies, I guess it depends on what it is that you're proposing or what the project would be.
So if the dollar depends on the granting agency. So if the state were involved, the state would have to say, hey, I want to see an ITS architecture component. If you're going to do this ITS project, I want you to make sure it's in the architecture.
Okay.
And if there's feds involved, I think they would do the same thing. You say, hey, you need to in fact, they do say the same thing. Exactly. My lack of clarity is how federal highway is not quite clear about they say, yes, you have to have an architecture, but they don't really step in and say, you have to use it for this. You have to use it for congestion management systems. You have to use it for safety action plans. You have to use it for.
They're not asking to see.
They're not asking for that.
Right.
I think our role as an MPO, we have 4 pillars, one of which is convene. So we convene groups, and I was just thinking we could have a series of seminars on particular ITS topics, which would allow the LPAs who are implementing it or thinking about it to present. But also, if we're not implementing, say, ITS and safety, we could bring in ITS and safety experts from other places. So as part of our convening process, we could do that kind of work. And I could see some benefit, we could call it new technologies, implementation for safety, new technologies for this, and then kind of mention, hey, if we implement new technologies, this is our overarching ITS idea. That allow us to improve the ITS planning. I see the ITS implementation plan there, and I think so. I think the MPO's role is one of coordination, informing, bringing information from the feds and the state as to what they want to see in the architecture. Because the informing and convening is part of that. Planning is part of under our wing, right? But I think basically we want to leverage everything that the different LPAs are doing. I don't see guardian as not a good word. We're not the guardian. I know we're kind of sensitive about that guardian word.
We don't want to gatekeep.
No, we're not. But we could be, maybe basically a guide and bringing information to the table. I think I can see the MPO's role being in that mode. And I'm just interested in federal highways. Where is federal highway going with this? Because it seems like there's been this effort, almost like congestion management system. There's been this wing over here doing congestion management system. Then let's build the roads. The MTP only includes capacity increasing projects. I could see opportunities from the architecture to increase capacity and provide more safety without building more lanes.
That's exactly right.
It would seem to be a logical component of that, but I don't see federal highway. I see federal highway as being fragmented in their approach toward planning and work. But those are just some thoughts I had. Yeah, those thoughts are Tismo thoughts. Those are Tismo thoughts.
Yeah.
That's what it all comes down.
We'll get to that, right?
I've never Tismoed before, so there.
Well,
Tismo later.
Operations. It's all operations because that's ultimately what we're doing with ITS, right? We can't build our way out of the problems that we have. We can't just keep building capacity into the hard capacity into the roadways. We have to manage what we have better, more efficiently, get more capacity out of what we already have. That's what ITS is all about. So, and that's where Tismo's going. It took a while, but they finally got some traction in USDOT and Federal Highway to codify it that way. That this operations is very important to the way we operate with airplanes. And so that's the movement that's going on. When it comes to federal grant programs, architecture is required. You have to show it because you're getting federal funding for these projects. So whether the state division office for Federal Highway is enforcing it a certain way, now you're really tied more back into that higher USDOT level, right? That it will be part of those grant programs.
I've seen some language in those grant programs implying that it must serve a regional audience, we'll say, right? And so, which makes me think we're all going to be working together in the end if we want to be able to for grants.
So I think you, from an architect, talking about, you don't want to all of a sudden get to that point of you're going in for a grant program and go, oh, crap, architecture is not up to date. We can't actually show what we need to show. You want this to be a living document that's going along with the rest of your planning. You want this to be part of the tool set that you use for laying out where you're going with ITS across the region. It's always there. It's up to date. Convener is a great idea, a great concept, I think, from the standpoint of this. The MPO can convene the groups that need to be put together. All of you here, others as well. And what I've seen different from when we started this process is there's more and more engagement as we go along. There's a lot more to do. But this is a tool that actually become a values stakeholder. When we find your place as an organization, this is to your department. I have this stuff in the architecture. That's yours, but it's part of this larger concept that we're trying to do with ITS. So ownership is a big part of this. Involvement. It doesn't have to be a constant. It's not going to be a 24 hours a day thing. But you need to have some kind of access to it and that it's always being updated. That's why the maintenance process we'll talk about in a little while is important, that it doesn't wait for 10 years before we update the architecture, that it's something that's actually going along and being used. And that's why defining projects in your architecture as we have now that you all provided, that's the hook, in my opinion. Now there's something tied to what we're actually deploying. And we identify it that way, and it's related directly to the architecture. Now I go deploy that project and it's complete. Well, now that's part of the overall architecture I as a framework that I reference, but there's another project comes on behind it. It won't be the last one. There will always be projects in that queue, and that drives this TIP process, right? There's projects should be represented in your architecture that are in the TIP. If they're federally funded or not, my opinion.
Well, we're gonna have a lot less federally funded on the roadway side, because we're shifting to what's called the federal exchange, where the state is exchanging federal dollars for state dollars, and starting in 2025, just around the corner, our dollars will actually be state dollars, subject to the states.
Okay.
So the state's participation in this is really critical, in terms of understanding who will follow under that. I think overall, as I look at this, from my MPO role, it's that what I think our LPAs, we want to keep front and center for the LPAs is that as you're moving from community to community in our region, you don't want the drivers to have to encounter real differences in how driving happens and how systems operate. Because if you have that, then all drivers that'll create confusion amongst drivers and create a problem where they won't know, and everybody's drivers go to other places in the community, more or less. So that's kind of an overarching objective, I think, that should be as part of ITS is making sure that the driving experience, you don't want your markets to be markedly, this is the reason for US DOT signal signage regulation.
Yeah.
So that your signs don't look so markedly different, you can't navigate when you get in another community.
I think the biggest challenge is gonna be ensuring that we continue to communicate with people that actually aren't in this room right now, and like IMPD, the agencies that aren't deploying true transportation projects, but they're deploying things out in the field that would be extremely beneficial for us to know about. And so, they're doing that. They're not, IMPD isn't spending transportation dollars, so they're not gonna get hooked in on any of those requirements. It's I think it's getting back to what you were saying. If you're funding a locally funded project, how do we ensure that that's kind of reflected in this overall architecture?
I think one of the ways you get them engaged is hook them into see the benefit you get as a IMPD in being part of this, because there's benefit to them too.
Right.
Law enforcement in general tends to be a little bit standoffish when it comes to these kind of things anyway. But when you show how they can be engaged and how they benefit from it, they start to draw in.
We've got a handful of mile vision cameras that have been installed, and IMPD is installing cameras, and I was like, hey, did you know that we have detection cameras and there's video and so like I think you're absolutely right. I think that's where
We reached out to organizations like that way at the beginning and didn't really get anything back, probably for the reason of, even why are we even talking to you or working with you?
Yeah.
So, we attempted that participation, but I think we need to keep working on that.
Very common, but it's also one of those, if you build a table of type of things, I think, you start to say, but you're in here, whether you came to the table or not, you're in here, IMPD. Now, do we got it right? And look at all these other things you could be getting. That's the framework discussion that you can have around this structure that's already put in place. To say, well, no, that's not the way we work. Okay, well, tell us how that does happen. And is there something else you could benefit? How do you interface with the city of Carmel? Whatever it might be, or what other myovision, just that's a great example. You got something already in place. You could be leveraging that. You go to other, you go to a lot of different places that now you'll see co-location of law enforcement in operations centers, because that's where all the data is.
We're seeing that now. I mean, everyone knows block LPRs and all the other things that are out there. I mean, I've never seen police agencies work so well together, across jurisdictions, right? All of a sudden they're sharing information.
Yeah.
It's amazing, right? But when they first came to us, I was, they just went on their own, right, to do these solutions. Did you guys know that transportation's been doing high-speed tolling for years, right? You're looking at the wrong experts,
Right.
For your ideas there. But those are things we can leverage, right? And open up across jurisdictions and get in other places.
And that's where convening comes in. That's bringing the people together and understanding that if you're coming across for this particular thing, if you have to go get the carrot out there to get them in the room.
You have to have package the meetings to avoid, I'm sure that it takes a while, it takes, half an hour to describe what an ITS is. It's useful if you if you talk about, come up with language like public safety and transportation technology or technology and public safety, and then you open up yourself up to a wider audience and maybe cast your net a little bit deeper. But yeah, I think that's
Cliff, something I'm thinking about and wrestling with here is we're talking about this on a regional level, right? Which is Central Indiana, the MPA, but there are things that might want to be implemented on a regional level that requires state approval, right? Not just, I'm thinking like automated enforcement, or projects that like electric vehicle charging, like that's a statewide implementation, but there's also regional impacts, right? So like, how does that get roped in here where you like, I'm thinking from the enforcement side, like you need statewide consensus, buy-in, like I'm thinking 3 years from now, right? Legislature's gonna say, what can we do to make this happen? Right. And we'll have nothing in place to be able to show, case studies or example of what technology could be. Maybe it's a goal for one region and not for another.
Right.
But like to the consistency point, like how do we lead that and be prepared for that if that should come?
Well, I think that's a great point from the standpoint of, this is a regional thing we're talking about here, but there's a statewide architecture, right? So I don't know, what was the last update?
probably about the same.
Yeah. Okay, so what we want to do with that, there's like 350 architectures across the country, from metropolitan to multi-state to statewide, all these different configurations. A lot of them overlap. Florida, good example, 8 different architectures. One is a statewide, so it covers everything, but it's covering the state systems. And then you have district architectures that are covering like region, they're essentially regional architectures. There's relationships between the state and the district architectures. You have statewide systems that are interfacing at district levels and vice versa. But that's the kind of conversation that needs to happen of, okay, well, we have these different architectures. What's included in yours? What are you doing? And what are we doing at this district level or regional level? And make sure that they're compatible, that they reflect the same, those particular interfaces. That means we have to convene those stakeholders together from both sides, the state, and have those conversations. That's something that now with an architecture for the central Indiana region, we can go say, well, we have this. Let's talk from the statewide standpoint. How do we link these together? It's a great observation.
I think that's really a good point. It's almost like a Venn diagram of what's common, but then what could be done here centrally that may not have been done statewide, or maybe vice versa. That could be part of like, okay, what's coming?
Yeah.
Or what can be added to maybe the central or maybe even state can kind of like take that as maybe a view for including that for a statewide, because again, it's geographic. Every region, every part of the state has different needs or requirements. So I think that might actually, but that's really great point to make sure that coordination is happening. Again, Andy, I was using guardian just as I was actually thinking a strong word, parent. I was saying parent is not a right one, so maybe guardian, but I think that really is a good way of putting that.
Warriors.
And I think one other thing to Nathan's point about, again, just using IMPD as an example, I think, yes, it's always difficult to get someone on the table. But once it goes back to maybe what is the benefit that they are getting out of this and how it's going to tie back to their core values, which is safety, public safety, and maybe if you're using efficient ways of doing that, then I think City of Indianapolis, and again, because it's IMPD, I'm just saying that City of Indianapolis is vested in this. It could be Carmel Police Department. They are vested in this as part of the regional. And I think that's where we, as kind of like the leaders here in this group, can really show them the benefit to really kind of like bring them on the table as well, to really help with continuing this on a regular, quarterly, maybe bi-yearly basis, whatever it might be, so that we can get feedback from them as well. I mean, to your point, Morgan, I know law enforcement has been working so closely more now than it used to be, like maybe 5-10 years back. So I think it's a low hanging fruit in my opinion that we should really get them on. It's almost like engineers, like you want to keep doing the nerdy things, but then I think getting people to speak and kind of like talk about that, I think it's always a challenge, but I think we can do, this group has the ability to kind of like influence that.
What you're talking about with the carrot, you know, one of those things we always make use of is special events or short-term things. So, you know, whether that was a Super Bowl when we had it, but you know, our next big thing is the eclipse in April, right? You know, and so we're all dealing with traffic situations and, you know, we're just gonna get them out of the city as fast as we can, send them to 465 in Westfield, right? You know, and so.
I'm not leaving my house.
Right. So, you know, these are things that we can maybe meet upon a special event topic and use this as a.
Your weather system that says where it's not cloudy in Indiana, so you target people to go to the right.
Yeah, and I'm doing a rain dance and hope everybody. So,
But it doesn't matter because IMS already said that they're doing a watch party.
right,
I think they're
NASA.
doing like a big thing, they're bringing NASA here.
Really?
Yes, and Morris Speedway.
Yeah, well, yeah, okay.
Yeah, let's not think about it.
anywhere it rains.
Maybe we should plan on having this group meeting during that watch party. I think that might be good.
I had a question, quick question, you know, NDOT's doing work with us, when they have some of their systems in there. I wonder what the tools offer in terms of coordinating different architectures. Because you've got an issue where NDOT, you know, enter once, don't have to enter 3 or 4 or 5, 6 times. Makes it easier for the agencies that coordinate with other bodies to enter their data once and have it be used many times. And be able to just be distributed to basically have a starting point for architectures in different areas. So I'm pretty sure all our other MPOs have ITS architectures. The question is how to share them. How does the tool setups make that? So as we go through the tools, if there is something like that, we'd want to know about.
I'll tell you right now, there's not.
There's not, okay,
There's not.
but I guess,
If we need to have like a sidebar about that later, cause that could end up being a longer conversation, maybe on how we approach that.
I mean, that's a real, you talk about competing within the region, but then you talk about competing for the other MPOs in the state. We have a state MPO body. And we could make that part of the conversation we have our MPO meeting here next year. Yeah. So, that could be a major topic for coordination for.
Let me play off of what you said, and this ties into what Matt was getting at, I think. You don't have to address everything in every architecture. Okay, think about this. What Matt was getting at, electric vehicle charging, we want to be consistent with that. Okay, but we want to take that aspect and make sure that's consistent across those architectures. Okay, we don't want to have to worry about Indigo's operation in all the other regions, right? So let's think of it that way. That's where Florida is approaching. When we have the statewide architecture, it's only dealing with statewide systems, and any kind of outside influence from the other architectures is where that particular system interfaces with that. 511 is a great example. I'm collecting information from all those different areas for the statewide 511 system. Well, I only have to worry about those interfaces. I don't worry about all the other things that are not associated with 511. So we find those topics that are consistent across those architectures, and we use that as the platform to have a discussion about how that's done. And then we put in place procedures about how we all do it the same way, and how you flow through the architectures. We don't have the tools to actually make that automatically propagate.
But there are people who are working in that mode.
Yes.
Specifically Florida.
Yeah.
But there might be are there any other locations for junction? You're just doing the same thing?
Actually, we're in the middle of doing a change on their architecture where they had 5 regions, and now we converted from 9 districts back in 2000, we went to 5 regions. Now they want to go back to districts again. So we're converting everything back. But that's the kind of thing where, those relationships still have to be maintained with the statewide when it comes down to it. Matt, did you have a question? Okay.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, all right. I love these conversations. This is the stuff we really need to, get this out. These are the next steps that leads to the next phase of making it even better when we perform. So amazing what a diagram can do. So this basically just, I'm going to clip through a couple of these things pretty quickly now. From a project or architecture perspective, architecture is actually a planning process in itself. Just like we do in the transportation planning, we start with needs and we proceed toward involving the projects. Architecture starts out with needs. We gather information and inventory about what we have. We identify the information exchanges, and we end up with projects that come out of the architecture that define how we implement it going forward. So, and we end up in standards, linkages, and things like that as well. So there's both are following a process of going from needs into projects as we go forward. Now, think about your long-range transportation planning and what you do with operational strategies. And we have our regional goals and objectives, and then we start looking at alternative improvement strategies. We could either go out and build more roads, put more concrete out there, more pavement, do capital projects, or we can look at operations. That's where we get into ITS. ITS, we can do all these different things with ITS that feed into the operations component. Because we want to consider those as strategies. We start looking at planning what we're going to do next with addressing the issues we have with transportation. That's where ITS really starts to fill in. Well, there we go. So we can look at the services in the architecture. A lot of those align with those different ITS, we can find those linkages. Architecture services point us to those strategies we may want to start considering in long-range planning. Do we want to do electric vehicle charging across the state the same way? Well, how do we do that? What do we need to have involved? We have charging stations. We have payment we have to make at the charging. The electric utilities have to be involved, right? So all these standards need to be put in place, so we understand they're all done consistently. There has to be a management strategy to it as well. So there's all these things that go into just that one thing of electric vehicle charging. It's not just dropping a box out there and people come to it. There's a lot more to it. How do we do that consistently? So architecture services, there's an architecture service for electric vehicle charging station management. We can use those kind of things to actually point us to the things we need to be focusing on and doing further analysis. But if we look at overlaying the operational strategies we have with the architecture services that are possible, now we can start to see, are there gaps between what are we missing that we need to put in place? So now we actually can both feed each other and get a more comprehensive approach on what our alternatives might be. Just as an example, if we want to improve traffic flows by 50% during peak periods, we'll do a strategy. Ever tried that before?
50%.
Yes. So we can look at signal timing and optimization on corridors. We can educate the residents on alternative modes of transportation. We can put out changeable message signs and say, hey, take these alternate routes. Well, there's services in the architecture that actually align with those as well. We can now start to put those together to understand how these three pieces fit. Signal timing, signal traffic control, regional traffic management, looking at the overall corridors. We don't have something on education necessarily, but we have traveler information. We're providing them with services that, like traveler information, that inform them of alternative routes. And then when it comes to dissemination of DMS signs, we have a service for that too, for the traffic information dissemination network. So it gives us that there's something to start grabbing a hold of and considering. So we have these potential strategies that we want to then prioritize and evaluate and select, and then those are going to be included in our long-range transportation plan. Architecture is involved in that process as we go forward. All right, so now we're coming out. We've identified a project out of the long-range planning process, and now we're getting to programming and budgeting. You guys need to slow me down if you have a question. Ask me, because I'm going to start clipping through these pretty quick to catch up a little bit. So the architecture, we have all these projects that we have that we're considering for in the planning process. We've been through the long range plans. We have these projects that have come out. Some are civil projects, with ITS, some are just direct ITS projects. There's a mix where we have architecture helps us with understanding what those projects are, especially the ones that go ahead. Oh, what I did I touch some?
I think you,
That's touch sensitive. That's what.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's really
Just the screen sharing.
Maybe a big iPad.
need some information exchange here.
Yeah. I did
Feel
that.
good after this.
Start speaking.
There we go. Cool. Thank you, sir. So
Don't touch it.
the architecture's informing us about the components in these architectures that we have that we're considering. And as we go, the MPO looks at that, puts together the plan with the stakeholders. We get further looking at it as a framework, making sure we're keeping that big picture in mind, how they all fit together. But then we can start to prioritize the projects. Which projects should come first? We're going to talk about this a little bit more when we get in the exercise. You start looking at how projects need to be looked at differently from the standpoint of not just the whole thing. There may be a difference in this project's going to give us something I need to leverage for this other project. So this project needs to come first. If I do it backwards, I'm wasting time. The other project's not going to be able to deal with it. And ITS is very much that way. It's a very integrated environment. So we get this prioritization of projects coming out that we now are using in the tip, and we know what they are, and by knowing what there are in architecture sense, I get a scope for that project. Now I can start to look at budgets a lot differently than just saying it's a couple lines on a description for that project. I have to understand who's involved in it and what needs to be built. So linking to the objectives and needs of the region, that's what we're really getting a sense of this year. Andy, you asked me a question in one of our first meetings about options, objectives and goals for the region. I'm going to show you something just real quick before we get too far, because I want you to keep this in mind as we go forward. In the regional art, in the architecture, this is in Radit. So, but I just want to show you what we've done. So for the region, we put in the goals and objectives from the 2050 plan. Okay. So if I select a project, let's say multimodal travel, multimodal accessible travel, the planning component of that. And I go to planning. I've identified of our goals, improve job access for Central Indiana commuters, and objective of improved job access. It links it to the specific performance measures and the services that are identified, but that's all tied to that project. Now, going forward, as I go to deploy that project, I'm actually linked all the way back to the goals I have in the transportation plan for that particular project. That's an important link, in my opinion, because it says we're actually looking at this project as satisfying or addressing that. Now I get into evaluation later on after the project's deployed. Well, how well did that project do in bringing that goal, addressing that goal? So there's a tie here between. Not everything's going to tie. There's some of these goals are more, if you will, they're more. They're not ITS oriented. We're not going to really see some things, especially like bridges and stuff, unless I'm deploying monitoring on the bridges for failure or stress or whatever it might be. That's information I could be using in ITS to monitor the bridge security. So there's things like that that could be tied to that. We don't have any of those defined right now in the architecture, but that's the kind of thing we can start to look at as well.
And this is something we'll keep in mind because we're actually in an update process now for our long range plan. So we'll be able to go in, and if we change what our goals are, then we can come in here and change them too.
Yep. I didn't forget about your comment.
That's fun. You always know.
Be bad news. So the benefits in programming and budgeting is, we're able to keep that regional view. So we got that link to our objectives and our goals overall, but we keep that regional view. We're not just zeroing in on a specific project. It has a relationship. That project has a relationship with other projects and other things in the region. And basically that convening when it comes down to it, coordinating projects, what other organizations do we need to be bringing into the mix? But we're all referencing the same thing when we do that. That's an important part of it. So we're all talking the same language. Now, from a standpoint of the projects, you look at the architecture and the tip, look at budgeting. Well, I have a traffic or a city TMC, I've got a bus rapid transit system, I got 511 identified in my architecture. Well, those show up as different line items in my tip. But from the architecture, I understand there's a linkage between bus rapid transit and the city TMC. I need to make sure that my budget has accounted for that particular interface. It's not just about the city TMC. It's about how it connects to these other systems. Do I need to deploy that interface when I deploy that project? Do I need to deploy the interface?
We just need to know about it.
I need to know about it because my design of my city TMC or my bus rapid transit system may be different if I know I need to hook it up later on. Okay, if I know that interface needs to be implemented, it won't be included in the first round of that budgeting project I've got right there. I need to make sure I don't preclude it from happening in the future. Okay, so my design needs to reflect that interface to the extent it needs to, but I don't have to implement that interface. So that may be a savings of cost on the front end, but I need to pay for it somewhere along the way. I don't want to pay for it by redesigning the system to accommodate it the next time I have to implement that interface.
Just like building a bridge for 3 lanes, but we're not widening the road for 10 years.
Right, right. So the architecture gives us that insight, so we know what we're including in the project definition. So we have this overall architecture. This is just a graphic from that standpoint, but that's out of our architecture here. We can look at different integration opportunities. That's previous where I'm thinking about those interfaces with other systems. That's what we're talking about here. What do I want to tie together? In this case, what we have here is from the standpoint, things may come out differently in time. I mean, project A needs to come out, was going to come out today, but I need to make sure I have that interface that I want to do in project B if I have that tied together. These are actually 2 different projects we have in the architecture right now. One's multimodal accessible travel planning. The other one's multimodal accessible travel integrated payment. So there's a sequence to it. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's just the way we built it in the architecture right now. But that's an important part of understanding how we sequence projects. That gets us to satisfying one of the Rule 940 things for the feds, sequence these projects, understanding the order of the projects and how they come out, the dependencies that they have. So if I'm looking at a system where I've got a traffic management center and I'm collecting information from the roadway systems that I have for that system, the roadway system, the TMC field devices, I'm gathering information about congestion, traffic volumes, whatever it might be from my sensors out there. But eventually I want to give the state police and the city police dispatches. I have 2 other projects that are going to be tying their interfaces in. Okay, there are 3 different projects, but which one do I want to do first? Guesses?
Monitoring equipment.
When I get the monitoring equipment, I don't have anything to share for projects B and C with the police and the state police until I have the information. So I want to make sure I'm doing A first and then tie the other ones in later. They could all be in the same project. This is an oversimplification, but that's the idea here, is looking at what I need to have first versus others. So when we look at the architecture, I get all this information about all these different systems that are in the architecture in my TS in the region. And when I start scoping the project, so I'm leading toward project budgeting, I get an idea of what's going to be included from the standpoint of stakeholders involved, because that's going to be how we're going to do all the interfacing and originally to make sure we got everything done. Are there other integration opportunities I want to involve a different partner along the way? We know the elements we're gonna have, or the systems involved, we have the interfaces identified, there's integration opportunities. If there's dependencies on time, if there's dependencies on functionality that need to be accommodated, and then we can make that budget estimate. That all feeds it from the architecture. It's another tool to be using in the budgeting process. Then we talked about this earlier about bringing projects to the MPO. You ask for submittal of projects for including in the plan. Those are brought forward. If I bring it forward with an understanding of the architecture that's associated with it, how it fits in with what I'm doing in the region, that's just more information. We get to prioritizing those projects. Now we start to understand, okay, these need to come first. These could come second. There's dependencies in there we've already understood because we looked at the architecture that way. So how do we make it useful? Well, tying those objectives and strategies together, like we just talked about a second ago. That's a start. Making sure that there's a reason for this project. It's there for this particular objective. Describing the mid or long-term ITS implementation. So we're not just looking at the short term. We want to be looking farther down the road, making sure that we're looking 10 years out. What do we think is coming up that we're going to need from an ITS perspective? Going to your executive, MPO, and say, hey, this is what we're doing with architecture in the region. This is where we're going. This is what it's going to give us. And we're tying it to our goals, our objectives. It starts to, from their perspective, there's something to attain there. And that's how it ties in with the long-range plan. It's not just about these specific projects. It's about the overall approach we're taking for ITS across the region. Get formal approval of your architecture. This is something we're going to use. It's a living document. It's part of the region. This is the way we're going to plan ITS. And then we have something we're referencing. It's something everybody agrees to do. And kind of get back to the conversation we had earlier. How do we get people engaged in this process? Well, this is one of those things. So as we get near-term projects, we're going to start defining those more specifically as they come into view. We want to promote the integration of the projects in the region. This is how it fits, and this is the other things it's going to enable. And make that architecture use part of the process. It's not just something how does this fit? I don't know. We've already brought that to the table. Projects that were brought forward, here's a strategy. You say when you're bringing a project forward for the planning process, you need to be bringing your project architecture along with it. Okay, that's one way to get stakeholders engaged. Bring forward the architecture and make it part of the process. Okay, so we come out of the TIP process now. Just quickly on the implementation, Rule 940. So the architecture and standards rule for federal highway is Rule 940.09. There's also a Rule 940.11, which is the systems engineering analysis rule. Okay, and it identifies several things here. These 7 different items need to be included in that analysis. But this again goes back to if you're a project funded with federal dollars, ITS project, it needs to be going through a system engineering analysis. Well, these 7 items that they've identified in the rule, of those, 4 of these we can support directly with the architecture. 1, defining what part of the architecture you're actually implementing with this project. What participating agencies you have involved and what are their roles and responsibilities in the process of that project. What are those requirements definitions? What's it going to do? Have you defined what those requirements are? And then standards. What standards are you implementing? What are you going to use as far as standards? Often for an interface, there's more than one standard you could possibly use. Which one are you using? And this gets back to another comment about the statewide stuff. There are certain things you want to make sure that you're all using the same standard. That's across the state. So those implementations that are broad like that, all done the same way. Therefore, then you get back to, I'm going from one jurisdiction to the next, the experience is the same. And that's becoming more and more important as we get into connected vehicles. You don't want to have to change applications when you go from one place to the other. The data needs to be presented the same way. There's a standards being worked right now to do electronic traffic regulations. It's called meter. management of electronic traffic regulations. So what it is basically saying, okay, these automated vehicles, connected vehicles, you're not gonna be looking for a sign anymore. It's gonna be electronic, it's gonna come into the vehicle, and that automated vehicle will understand the regulations in that particular area. But the standards needed so that the automated vehicle gets the same from every single jurisdiction. Okay, those are the kind of things that are becoming more and more important for standardization. Because before it used to be fixed devices out there that we do sensing, right? But now the sensors are coming from all these vehicles roaming around, and they're all crossing boundaries. Fixed things stay in one place.
Does that get location specific, or if we're talking intersection specific, is that still relying on signage?
As you go down the street, you'll be getting a speed limit sign that will give you that.
So a no right turn on red, for example, at certain intersections, that's part of it.
Yep. So that stuff's becoming even more important. From the standpoint of mapping to the architecture, we've already got that built into with the projects you have today, identified in the architecture. You can walk in with your project to the feds and say, here you go. Here's my portion of my architecture that I'm implementing. So it identifies the services, inventory elements, the functional requirements, the interfaces, all satisfying the rule 940.11. Again, from the standpoint of looking at future integration, different ways, different phasing of projects. If I have one that's depending on another, and there's a sequencing of that. So this phased implementation becomes a way of kind of saying, okay, here's the architecture for the project I'm implementing today, but then also we're going to be expanding that in the future, and here's how it ties in with that future project. Back to our diagram again, we start looking at use of project development. The biggest problem I think we have in ITS is we get out here and we with a project, we start thinking about a project, but we're actually applying what we want. This becomes not needs focused, it becomes want focused. And we pull requirements back in here to the TIP process, but they're only our requirements. They haven't been through a system engineering process. Say these are real requirements that we really. I want 5 of these. I want this TIP to do these particular things. Is that really what the requirement is? Because often when somebody says I want something, you have to ask the question why like 3 times to get to actually what the requirement is. Because they start to take apart what they want, and you have to get it down to what they needs drive different kinds of requirements.
Sounds like toy shopping.
Exactly.
It's like you're like, oh, I want all of this.
Yeah.
But you don't think about if you need it or not.
It's a casualty of the way we're presented with information, right? We're marketing things, and that's the only thing you see. So therefore, yes, that's what I want. Well, no, what's your problem? What are you trying to solve? You need to be careful about that. But that's where the system kind of breaks down. The process breaks down is because we tend to have those different kind of tendencies of wanting things because we see them. That will address my problem. What problem? What problem are you addressing?
You're describing like every time I go to Menards.
Yeah.
I have this problem.
So, but
Kids.
don't take your kids to So when we're in project implementation, we're on this side, right? So we're really getting into the requirements-driven process. The architecture is helping us with understanding that needs focus. It's now changed into requirements-driven. We're still have that consensus vision that we're relying on to give us reference. Now, no system engineering conversation couldn't be complete without a V diagram for system engineering. This is the system engineering V diagram. If you're not familiar with it, it's the process you follow for developing any system. Architecture hangs out on the front end of this. Okay, it's out there. It's a reference. So when we get into the system engineering process, we go through the concept development. We're actually getting into certain phases that we can feed architecture directly into. Concept of operations, one of the first things you do. Concept of operations tells us about the need that we're addressing and the vision that we have for how we're going to address that. It's not supposed to be about the technology necessarily, but it's about how we envision the system operating going forward. So it's a high level thing, but from that we derive requirements for the details of the project or the system. So the concept of operations, I talked about before how the synthetic tool actually gives us that start to it. Well, then what it's doing is it's pulling in the elements of the architecture that we have for the project, the information flows, the services we've identified, and the stakeholder roles and responsibilities. Those are all feeding the system, the concept of operations development in the system engineering process. Next step is then to derive requirements from that vision we have for system for concept of operations, from the concept of operations, and develop those system requirements. That system requirements we identify in the architecture give us that high level start on that. They're very high level, but they give us that start, so we know where I'm starting from scratch. And it's also they're based on the overall picture that we have for that project. And then we get down to detailed design, we start getting into those standards. That's getting specific. Now I'm defining specific things on those interfaces that need to be designed for. And so that feeds into that design process. So now we've gone from the planning side of influencing strategies to looking at how we budget the projects that we identified out of that that are going to satisfy those strategies. And now we're defining and using architecture to help us start the detailed process of project development in system engineering. System engineering is another 2-day course of just overview from the standpoint of getting into the high level stuff about system engineering. There's a lot of similarity, in my opinion, of system engineering planning. Very parallel activities. I see with project management as well. Should all be needs focused. Everything starts with needs. System engineering, planning, project management. So they're similar processes, they just have different languages. If you ever go through the PMP foreign training, I thought I was sitting in a system engineering class when I did that. All right. You made it through the longest slide deck we got for this training. Any questions?
Maybe one. More detailed, right? So as we talk about standards, right? Is the ITS framework ever going to define like manufacturers or things that maybe apply or adhere to standards? And do standards get as low as like data exchange, protocols, things of that nature?
Exactly, that's exactly what they get to. No,
I know from Iteris' standpoint.
No,
not. I mean, I'm asking your opinion. Like, I mean, are you guys developing products that fit to all the standards that ITS currently defines?
Those are our guides. We know what our products need to fit into the standards that are out there because that's what clients are asking for. Okay, especially when it comes to any kind of standardization of a system that will be using different kinds of technologies. So we build our products to those. Do we get it right every time? That's hard because the standards keep it right sometimes. But the bottom line is that's what we try to do is make sure that we're not just throwing something out there with a proprietary standard for interfacing to it. We want it to interface with a whole bunch of different systems. So we want to come in and say, well, yeah, you got this right now. This will work the same way, but we give you these other features, but it hooks into your system the same way.
Gotcha.
Right?
What do you see as the top level that are helping influence those standards? Is that a federal DOT level ITS, or is that manufacturers pushing what they know into that?
There's a whole bunch of different organizations. We get involved in standards development. There's a lot of manufacturers that are involved. They want to be there so they can influence it, but also they want to know what it is when it's approved. But there's also some organizations, some agencies are engaged in that process as well. I think the standards environment, US DOT has funded standards development for ITS activities. So they have contracts for cooperative agreements with standards development organizations, IEEE, SAE. They are developing standards for ITS and trying to drive that. But there's a whole other process that those or standards development organizations employ. And those standards, you know, the ownership of those standards, you have to pay for something because that's the way that kind of works. But then that's all trying to be driven by USDOT. There's a whole program around that. The guy who manages for the national architecture, we work for Bob Sheehan at USDOT, the Joint Program Office. He actually has also under his wing his authority is the standards development program. So he's managing all those as together. There's a link between architecture and the standards. Architecture, the national architecture influences and provides guidance, if you will, to the standards, because they're looking at the whole picture. Here's the standards we need. We use it for standards harmonization internationally. We've been doing that too. We applied the ARCIT framework to look at, here's the scope of ITS. Well, what standards do we have? Well, these are gaps that aren't being addressed right now by standards, and they're needed. And so then the architecture then provides input into that process of standard. This is what the standard needs to address, these things. One of my guys is off in Singapore right now for standards. So, pretty good gig. But it's that's the kind of thing that there's influence here for a lot of different things. But you know, the people involved, it's the thing, get involved if you want to influence a certain thing. But yeah, that's what glues everything together to me. The standards are the places where everybody says, okay, this is what I'm going to employ. That's why it's important to look at it from a regional sense. We want to do this, but we're all going to do it, and we're going to do it this way. That way, when I go from City of Carmel down downtown Indy, we're all operating the same way. Right. And that's not necessarily something to do. Transit has to deal with different jurisdictions. Indigo deals with different jurisdictions. All
Luckily, we don't.
don't.
We don't, just one jurisdiction.
What jurisdiction?
Okay. You're Lawrence, City of Lawrence, that's gonna be, that's a little bit different, but yeah.
It's a little bit different, yeah, but they don't, I mean, the roads we operate on are still owned by the city of Indianapolis.
Okay.
I mean, thoroughfares, yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
That's not the case everywhere.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, and a lot of transit agencies span multiple road
Yeah.
agencies. Yeah,
That's a challenge.
that's a huge challenge.
As I always say, the technical stuff can always be solved. It's the institutional stuff that's the hardest. And that's just a challenge. But technically you can always settle into standards as a way of saying, yeah, we can all agree that this is what we want to do.
Yeah, we always see emerging technologies are the Wild West, and then eventually, this is why we all don't we're not early adopters, right? We wait for 5 years for, and EV charging is a good example of that right now. There's not, of course, we're standardizing on plugs, but not the back end technology as we talk about in the framework here. So that's going to be a challenge for us.
Yeah, it's hard to stay ahead on standards. You have to wait for the stuff to kind of, okay, this is what we need to do. But architecture,
There's a competitive aspect to standards development. It's been out there for years. I mean, anybody who's followed Microsoft group-wide, Microsoft changing their mailing standard because they wanted to get rid of group-wise. Well, I mean, that type of behavior has always gone on. And there's a huge incentive to be the standard, right? And becoming the de facto standard, which Tesla kind of accomplished in electronic charging by getting out there first. And beta versus VHS. I mean, the technology has this kind of a feel to it.
yeah.
And so it's good to have some of those standards, it's good that we've been so delayed in implementing. Because we're able to pick up, some of the benefits of that. We tried to do this 10 years ago, would have been a different story, whole different story. I get relevant questions. The Buy USA piece, has that been a significant issue in ITS?
I don't feel that it has. This is really, as far as a deterrent.
No, just a obstacle in implementation. Pieces and parts can't be delivered because they're not produced here in the United States.
And I've seen some issues with that along the way. So some things have problem about it, but there's so much competition, and there's a lot of influence from that standpoint. What you'll see if you look through the stakeholder list or the services list of architecture, we actually identify international services.
Right.
But Canada adopted the US architecture. They used to go off and copy ours and then go do it themselves.
Yeah.
But they finally said, okay, we're done with that. They don't have the federal support. So they basically adopted our architecture. We brought in some Canadian stuff. There's also a harmonization, standard harmonization effort we did using the architecture. There's Australian services in there, and there's some European ones as well. And so there's a US architecture. I'm trying to brag here about the US architecture, but it's the most comprehensive framework of ITS there is out there. There's ones in Japan, but they're very focused on Japan.
Right.
And Europe has frame. Frame doesn't get into the physical architecture. It's a functional architecture. It's a little bit more complicated from that standpoint. But they're also applying it in Europe, which is very distributed, if you will. It's like from a just institutional European Union. I mean, it's not the same kind of environment. So I think that there's when I look at ITS standards, the reason USDOT is involved is because they want to avoid that very thing you're talking about. Anybody dominating the market with one particular technology and approach. So they got involved very early. They've been involved with standards since the late 90s. And because they saw that was the most important part that they get involved in, because it wasn't happening. They didn't want it to happen with just a couple of organizations doing it and trying to enforce their own will. They wanted to see something that was more comprehensive and the word of collaborative. Okay. Take a second.
No, I was just gonna let you guys know, I did ask Ed Cox just to confirm on the statewide architecture question. He said it has been a while, and I checked our Y drive. I think like 2011 was the last time we truly had a full update, but we did do some updates recently, like maybe 2020 with the TSMO on the southeast side of 465. So there were some updates that happened more recently, but like a full update, I think it's been a while. So just wanted to throw that out there.
And that was because of the new 69 interface with 465.
So the TSMO,
Yeah.
so we've got ramp metering and variable speed limits that'll be going in on the southeast portion of I-465, and you'll actually be seeing that here before the end of the year.
The Emerson Avenue interchange, I saw those going in,
Yeah, it was not directly linked with 69.
But it does sound like it is the
Yeah.
portion between 69 and where 465
It
used
goes
to
on
be
the
here.
west.
Yeah.
Well, it's an impact of having 69 intersect, enter 465 at that location.
Cause now that southeast part is carrying
That's
the
become a
through.
whole different, a different structure. And I mean, it's essentially the same origin destinations, but there's gonna be an increase, there's an expected increase.
Yep.
So that'd be interesting.
Yeah, part of the TSMO of just trying to get all the capacity we can get out of 465.
That's right.
Without expanding.
Without having to expand.
Without creating these monsters.
Yeah, so like Emerson, you've seen it, and the plan, we've been having a lot of meetings on it. It should be going live here pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to see how it goes, but
Paper and all that good stuff, so people know what it is.
there should be
Okay.
public relations. Yes, there should be some, I think, Greenfield District has been involved with some public relations stuff on that front, just to explain to the public what it is. I think it'll at least start and flash the signals on the ramps to at least let people know for a while, like
That they're there.
there's something here, but I know public relations, I believe, has been involved with getting that information out there.
Yeah, there was a good update during the ITS Midwest. I think there was a good update on that one, so a lot of key stuff.